Bible surprises in 30 minutes. Why there should be more exclamation marks in this unique book. Writer, church pastor and Bible teacher Mike Beaumont explains all to David Taverner.
This conversation is called the dry sea. Well, that certainly is a contradiction in terms, because there is no such thing, as far as I'm aware anyway. What, Mike, are we talking about? The dry sea?
We're going to be looking in this episode at a sea that became dry through the miraculous intervention of God. So we're going to be looking at what historically is called the crossing of the Red Sea by the escaping Israelites on their way from their former slavery in Egypt as they set off on their journey to the Promised Land.
One of the most celebrated moments in the history of the Bible, for sure, and the people of Israel, I would have thought. Maybe Hollywood has done this a disservice to some extent because we've got the pictures in our minds.
Yeah, we have. That's the trouble, isn't it? And we end up then basing our reading of the story on what we've seen in the movies, whether that's we're of the generation of Charlton Heston playing Moses or whether we're more of the generation of the cartoon Prince of Egypt. And so we get these certain pictures in our minds. But what it would be good to do is actually look at the text itself, because as you say, this is one of the most crucial events in the whole of Old Testament history. This is what God's people will look back to again and again. This is what still today Jews celebrate every year at their festival of Passover, that incredible, miraculous deliverance of God when he freed his people from slavery in Egypt.
You might need to fill in some of the gaps then, or perhaps correct our understanding of the story. So give us the headlines.
Well, where are we up to? We have seen in previous episodes how God's people ended up in slavery in Egypt through having gone down there, the invitation of Joseph, how they multiplied while they were there, but how their growing numbers made Pharaoh feel threatened as the decades and centuries pass by, and how he therefore submitted them to slavery, cruel slavery, and used them for forced labor for building his cities. So far, so good with the cartoons and the movies. We've seen how he called Moses, encountering him at that burning bush, and sent him back with his strange staff to command Pharaoh to let the people go, and how after 10 plagues, he eventually agreed to let them go, a beaten man when his own son had died in the plague of the death of the firstborn. And so as we get now to chapter 14 of Exodus, we actually come to the story of how God's people escape. And as they leave Egypt, God does a number of things. First of all, he leads them in a particular way, in such a way that the Egyptians think they've got lost in the desert. After all, they've never been that way before. And so God does this to make Pharaoh think that the Israelites are wandering around in confusion, the text says. And then here's the first surprise of the story. God says, I will harden Pharaoh's heart and he will pursue them. Pharaoh has persistently hardened his own heart against every opportunity God has given him to respond, until the point has come now when God himself chooses to harden what Pharaoh hardened. And I think that's always a warning to us, to be careful not to harden our hearts, so we may find God hardening what we ourselves have hardened. And the surprise comes here. God then says, but I will gain glory for myself through Pharaoh and his army, and all the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. Perhaps you'll remember in a previous episode, we noted how Pharaoh said to Moses when he went and said, let my people go, he'd said, who is the Lord? Who is Yahweh? Dismissively, Egypt has enough gods, thank you, without any more. So this is all about God showing Pharaoh who is the Lord. So it's going to be a chapter that is full of surprises for everyone, except God, of course.
The numbers of Hebrews leaving Egypt, I suppose we have to get a sense of what we're talking about.
Yeah, if you work backwards from the numbers that are recorded in the book of Numbers, where there is a census taken of people once they are in the wilderness, and we allow for the number of women and children, just average it out, we are looking at something like 2 to 2.5 million people, a huge people group movement here, not unknown in the ancient world at all. So as we think of them crossing this, well, let's call it the Red Sea for the moment, though we want to come back to that. You know, it didn't happen in 5 minutes. That's one thing for sure, did it? This is a long time to get that sort of people numbers across the spread of water.
Before they get to the sea itself, though, there's quite a journey.
Yes, and it can't have been an easy journey. Remember, you have just escaped. You are escaping slaves. We've seen so often, haven't we, people trying to escape from countries, cruel regimes where they've been overtaken and people tried to flee. So this is not just, let's pack our buckets and spades and we're going off on holiday. We're going to a new country. There would have been, human nature being what it is, a mixture of exhilaration, being freed from their slavery, but also, no doubt, a mixture of anxiety and fear about what would happen. And in fact, as we read on in chapter 14, Pharaoh suddenly thinks, what have I done in letting these people go? And he decides to pursue them with his chariots. The Israelites see the Egyptians pursuing them. And we read in chapter 14 that they were terrified. And they cried out to the Lord and said to Moses, was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians? Brackets, no, you didn't. You really wanted to get out of there. It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. So here now is their fear, their dread, their panic added to that mixture of exhilaration and uncertainty that they would have had during these early days. And as Pharaoh comes out now to take his slave labor force back at the point of a sword, the panic really starts to arise and they turn on Moses and say, it was all your fault. We were doing very well. Thank you.
And they're not armed, but they've got armed soldiers coming at them.
Yeah, and it's only Moses really at this point who has faith. They're completely surprised by what has happened. Moses, well, he probably was surprised, but he holds his ground. It's like he knows who his God is, and so we go on to read, he says to the people, do not be afraid, stand firm and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. Wow, that was a big promise. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. So it's like he's calling them back to say, look, I understand this is a moment of anxiety. This has come as a big surprise to you, but come on, guys, we've just got to focus. Let's get our eyes back on God and what he has promised. Wise counsel for any of us who find ourselves in a position where everything seems to be going wrong and even what God said doesn't look like it's working out. Don't panic. Come on, stand firm and wait and see the deliverance that God will bring about.
I mean, that's not a natural thing to do, to be still when you've got chariots coming at you from behind.
Absolutely not. I mean, I find one of the best ways to read the Bible is to put yourself into it, to imagine how would it have been, how would I have felt, what would I have said at those moments. And I think to put yourself into that situation, first of all, of the people, yeah, they were scared, but I think put yourself in the place of Moses. That took a lot of faith. He really clearly had a powerful encounter with God at that burning bush. It had been life-changing for him. Nothing could ever be the same again. And so it must have taken incredible faith at that point. Although there's a little thing that happens in the story that follows, having said that to the people. The Lord then said to Moses, "Why are you crying out to me?" So clearly Moses must have cried out to God at that moment, must have prayed. And it's almost as if God's saying, "What are you praying for? I've told you I'm going to do this." Interesting, isn't it? There are times when we just need to stand clearly on what God has done. And the strange staff comes into play again that we've looked at in previous episodes. He says to Moses, "Tell the Israelites to move on, raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the water so that the Israelites can go through on dry ground. I'll harden the hearts of the Egyptians so they will go in after them, and I will gain glory through Pharaoh and all his army, through his chariots and his horsemen. And the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I gain glory through Pharaoh, his chariots and his horsemen."
The thing that keeps coming back to me is that they were escaping en masse, but they were being cornered. They didn't know, of course, that there was going to be this crossing of the Red Sea.
No, not at all. And I think that helps to heighten, doesn't it, this sense of dread panic that they must have felt. And yet, okay, you can't see a way forward, but at times like that, you have to go back and say, did God speak or no? Did God act or no? And if the answer is yes, he did, then you simply have to stand firm and trust that God will do what he said he would do, even though you can't see. And so it's now at this point that God has a surprise for them. Because remember, all this is no surprise to God. He's already said at the start of the story, I'm going to gain glory for myself through this. He knows where this is going. So it's not a surprise for him.
So God will find a way when there is no way.
Oh, absolutely. And that's exactly what he does here. We read that the angel of God who'd been traveling in front of Israel's army withdrew and went behind them. The pillar of cloud also moved from in front and stood behind them, coming between the armies of Egypt and Israel. And throughout the night, the cloud brought darkness to one side and light to the other. We'll look at the pillar of cloud in a future episode, but for the moment, let's just note that here's the first thing that God does. Here's the first surprise for them. They are thrown into dread panic. There is no escape. As far as they are concerned, there's water in front of them, the water from, quotes, the Red Sea. There's the Egyptian soldiers behind them. They are trapped. They are cornered. There is no way out. So surprise number one, God protects them. He just moves his cloud so that somehow miraculously it's light on their side and dark on the others. What can't an army do when it's dark? In those days, before nighttime goggles, they can't move. They're stuck. For the moment, what happens is he's giving the Israelites a breathing space until the next stage happens. And then the next stage happens as Moses does what God says, stretched out his hand over the sea. And we read that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. So this is miraculous, but it's miraculous through God using the forces of nature. He sends this strong wind to drive back the waters. We've seen how those things can happen in our own days with things like tsunamis, for example. If there's a landslip or an underwater volcano explosion and the waters withdraw, it's very easy for them to withdraw. And then as they come back, what do they look like? They look like a wall of water. So I think there is something natural here, because after all, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. He's in charge of all of this. But equally, through the natural, there's always something supernatural. And I think this is where I would part company with the Charlton Heston movie and the Prince of Egypt movie that has these waves of water towering up hundreds of feet high. It's very unlikely the waters were that high at this point anyway. And it's at this point I might really prick a few bubbles, because actually the Hebrew text of the Bible doesn't say that the Israelites crossed the Red Sea. Oh dear, there we go. Gone and popped your bubble, haven't I? The Red Sea that separates Egypt and the Arabian Peninsula, it almost certainly was not that. Why? Because the Hebrew text says they crossed not the Red Sea, but the Reed Sea. The Hebrew is the Yam Suf, which means a sea of reeds, a reedy sea. And at some point when the Bible was getting translated into English, it got mistranslated. In fact, it happened even earlier than that in the ancient Greek translation of the Old Testament. The Septuagint, Reed Sea was translated there, Red Sea. So the mistranslation went back even as far as that. And it's simply been perpetuated by tradition ever since. And even in excellent modern translations, they keep that because we're all so used to it. But if you look in the footnotes of any modern translation where it says Red Sea, it will have a little asterisk and at the bottom and say something like Hebrew Yam Suf, Reed Sea. So this was not the Red Sea. This was a reedy, marshy area, almost certainly of one of the inland lakes in that part of the world, where a strong east wind could easily have driven back the waters, dried up the muddy base so it was firm enough for people on foot to cross over, which of course the Israelites were, but so that the minute the Israelites started to pursue them, their heavy chariot wheels would sink straight down into that mud. The wheels would be clogged up and come off, as this story goes on to tell us, so that when God then causes the wind to stop blowing, the waters rush back sufficient to drown them all. But the pictures from the movies and the cartoons of a wall like 100 feet high or more probably has more to do with Hollywood than Holy Scripture.
Two quick questions then. One is, that sounds like you're almost implying there wasn't a miracle. I'm sure you've got an answer to that. But secondly, I thought in the text there's a reference to walls of water.
Okay, the first, I'm absolutely not implying there wasn't a miracle. This is a point in Israel's history that it will go back to again and again as a miraculous intervention of God. And I would not take away from that for one moment. All I'm trying to do is perhaps explain what might have been something of the mechanics of this miracle. After all, as I said a few moments ago, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the psalmist says. It's all his. So, for me, I don't like using the word nature, because the thing about nature is it's natural, and it was a word invented by people who didn't believe in God. Our better word is creation. This is not just nature, things that happen naturally by their own laws apart from him. This is creation that was brought about by the Creator, who is daily, moment by moment, intricately involved in it, in sustaining it. The so-called laws of nature, they're God at work. So I'm not for 1 minute wanting to say this was not miraculous, but this is God using his creation to bring about his purposes in the way that he will many times in the future again. For example, when the walls of Jericho collapse as the Israelites march round it 7 times on that last day, we know that that part of the world is very prone to earthquakes, and all the signs of what happened that day and what archaeologists discovered seem to suggest an earthquake happened. All that is the mechanism God used for this to happen. But the timing of it, just at that moment when they blew their trumpets, incredible. When the Israelites crossed the River Jordan, and as they set foot into the water, it stopped flowing. Why? The text itself tells us, it says that the waters piled up upstream at a place called Adam. And the word that's used there in the Hebrew suggests that that piling up happened because of a rockfall. Interestingly enough, in the 1900s, there was such a rockfall happened in Israel at exactly the same place, and the Jordan River stopped flowing. So this is not my doubting the miraculous at all. This is simply my trying to take what the text says and saying God used his world to bring about his miracle for his purpose.
And my second question was to do with the reference in the text, I believe, to the wall of water that then came together.
Yes, again, I don't want to take away from Scripture says. I just think we have to take away from our thinking what we have understood through Hollywood by wall of water. You know, we all know that a wall can be 2 feet high or 20 feet high or 200 feet high, but we've just become so used to thinking that the wall was this massive towering thing. Probably all of us have seen video footage of tsunamis sweeping in. There is undoubtedly a wall of water comes in. Reporters will often use that very expression for what is happening. Yet the height of it itself might, I don't know, be no more than 10 feet, 5 feet above the surface of the waves. But the power behind that wall of water in the tsunami is huge. So, yes, there was a wall of water, though later descriptions might be using poetic language to beef that up a bit. But, you know, read the Bible as it is, not through the lens of Hollywood. So, wall of water, absolutely. You just don't have to think of a 100-foot wall of water.
This conversation is called the Dry Sea, so you're not in any way implying that the sea didn't dry up.
No, not at all. And the text is very clear about that. Through this strong east wind that blows all night, the ground becomes hardened. Verse 21 of Exodus 14 says, Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind. Do you notice the two there, the miraculous and the natural? The Lord drove it back with a strong east wind. So I'm saying nothing the text isn't saying. The Lord of creation used his creation and turned it into dry land, and they were able to go through on dry ground. And the Egyptians obviously pursue after them, it goes on to say. And then verse 24, during the last watch of the night, the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud at the Egyptian army and threw it into confusion. He made the wheels of their chariots come off so that they had difficulty driving. Again, not hard to imagine. These heavy chariots on the dried up surface as the wind blew across the mud base of that water. It dries up enough to take people on foot. It can't cope with the weight of horses and chariots galloping across it. And so suddenly the Israelites get a great surprise as they hear the Egyptians getting their own surprise, saying, let's get away. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt. Interesting, the Egyptians see something that's happening. So the ground absolutely has dried up. The sea has become a dry sea until the Lord says to Moses, stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters can flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and horsemen. And we read this, Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea went back to its place. The Egyptians were fleeing towards it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen and the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them survived, but the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left. And that day the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians. And Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. And when the Israelites saw the great power that the Lord had displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord. They put their trust in him and in Moses, his servant. So absolutely, it became the dry sea for the Israelites. What a huge surprise. What a change from that panic, that dread fear of feeling that they were trapped with water in front and armies behind. But the dry sea gave way to become a very wet sea for those who had abused God's people and kept them in slavery all those years.
And you've said that this incident, memorable as it would have been, was very much a hinge, if you like, in their history.
Yes, they will constantly look back to this. They'll be constantly reminded when God gives Moses the law on Mount Sinai. One of those laws will include what he had said to Moses just a couple of chapters earlier, that they were to make this a permanent festival. So it's now written into the law as they come to Mount Sinai that every year on this date, they were to remember it, as Jews still do to this day. The Passover meal still celebrated, one of the most important festivals that Jewish families celebrate together, and still they would have today a lamb shank bone to remember the lamb whose blood was shed and daubed over the wall. These days they will have a paste to remind them, made of almonds. It's a very sweet tasting thing today, but to remind them of the mud with which they had to make their bricks. It will have salt water to remind them of their bitter tears that they shed. So probably the most significant event in the whole of Old Testament history, as God frees his people to begin the journey of taking them back to the promised land to become the people that he had called them to be.
And the lesson for today, bearing in mind what we said, that God can make a way where there is no way.
Yeah, if God has spoken, God will do it. That's really what I take out of this. And it doesn't matter what's ahead of you, and it doesn't matter what's behind you. If you are where you are because you know that God has spoken, he spoke through his word, he spoke prophetically, whether to you as an individual or a family or as a church, if you're there because God put you there, then don't panic. And certainly don't go back to Egypt. Hold your ground, stand firm, and experience for yourself the dry sea as God does what only God can do. Because he's really rather good at surprises and miraculous interventions to bring about his purposes.
You've been listening to Mike Beaumont in conversation with David Taverner. Bible Surprises in 30 Minutes is a United Christian Broadcasters production. For more about UCB, go to ucb.co.uk.